Welcome, everybody. My name is Carly Graham Garcia. I'm the Executive Director of the Feliciano Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. I am sitting off campus in our Montclair Innovation Lab, our off-campus incubator supporting student startups and startups around the community. As you join us, if you wouldn't mind muting and pulling up the chat feature, which is in the bottom middle of the screen. If you click on it, you'll be able to surface questions and comments for me, as I will serve as our facilitator today, interviewing Madeleine Barr, founder and CEO of Piecewise, which is a student debt repayment platform used to lower student loan default rates. A venture-backed startup begun by a former student. Madeleine is now no longer a student, but she started the business as a student. And as many of you know, we have a special focus on supporting and mentoring women entrepreneurs at Montclair State and within our Entrepreneurship Center. And so we're excited to welcome Madeleine to talk a little bit about building her business. I also want to note that Piecewise is backed by Oceans Ventures, which Stephen Rosenblatt has been a friend to us at the center, serving as one of our judges in our last Startup Montclair competition. He also invests Oceans Ventures in I Fund Women, which is a crowdfunding and venture capital platform run by the center's entrepreneur in residence, Karen Kahn, also another Montclair, New Jersey resident. So without further ado, Madeleine, welcome. Coolest Zoom background ever.
Oh yeah, you know.
Thanks for being with us virtually, and tell us a bit about Piecewise. What's the business?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for such an awesome introduction. Just to dive right in, so as Carly said, I was a college student. I graduated in 2016, and my biggest issue when I was a senior in college was feeling nervous about how I was going to deal with my student debt after I graduated. And for anybody that's a student during this time, like 70% of you know exactly what I'm talking about, that your balance is growing and growing. And obviously college is a great experience, but I had no idea how I was going to figure out paying it down. So Piecewise was born of my own stress about student debt, where I started looking at the processes that schools use to try to help students graduate. And I just really thought there has to be a better way, because I'm hearing from myself and from my peers that getting out of debt is really hard, and there's not a lot of guidance provided to students about where to start. So I started building this software while I was in school, actually, that was basically trying to help people figure out how to pay down their debt. And at first we just tested it out with students, but then eventually we got some interest from schools who wanted to use this to educate their students better. So that's what the idea was born of. And since we started, as you said, we raised venture funding, which was amazing because we could grow the business. But before we did that, we were in about 15 schools, helping students pay down their debt. Since then, we've grown now to 22 schools. So it's been an amazing journey, but if you really care about a problem personally, you're gonna have the passion to try to figure out something about how to solve it.
And really, as we know, breaking into academia and having colleges and universities as a customer can be incredibly challenging. What are you doing now in this moment, especially, you know, in this sort of, I want to say post-COVID-19, but I guess we're not quite post it yet. How have you pivoted to continue to work with those schools, but then also continue to attract new schools?
Yeah, so I'm sure many of you have read the headlines about this, but this is a really big moment of reckoning for higher education, that for the first time, schools really aren't sure if they're going to be able to have on-campus classes in the fall, or if they do have on-campus classes, what is that going to look like? How can we do it safely? It's affected enrollment in major ways, especially international enrollment, since travel is at an all-time low. Across the country, we're seeing a 25% drop in enrollment for international students and about a 15% drop in enrollment for domestic students. So talking to the school customers that we have, even though we were serving them with this one product that was basically helping their alumni get out of debt, what we were hearing from them over and over again is like, this is a secondary problem to this existential problem that we're experiencing, which is like, how are we even going to survive as a school? How are we even going to serve students if we don't know if we can be on campus? And especially since we don't know what's going to happen in the future, like schools might go back in the fall and then have to leave because of outbreaks. So hearing that from schools, we started doing some customer discovery around what's your biggest need, what are your biggest worries, and like what technologies are you looking at adopting to try to smooth some of these experiences so that you can make sure you're still providing students with an education. So Zoom's a good example of this. Zoom is actually some of the fastest technological adoption that's happened in the education sector because like schools needed a way to talk to people. But I still think it's not the best way to do education necessarily. It's really good for group meetings. It's not as good for making sure that students understand content. So we've been taking some of the learnings from building this course of trying to help people understand debt, and we're seeing if we can expand that software to try to help schools put their curriculums online so that students' learnings aren't affected by not actually being there in person. So for us, it's really been a moment of like hearing that our current business was helping, but it's more of a nice to have than a need, and trying to figure out what those needs are that schools have so that we can respond to them.
Yeah, that's great. I would remind folks on the call, if you're willing to mute and submit your questions to Madeleine in the chat, I'll make sure to surface them. So then tell us a little bit about Piecewise business model and how it's changed, because clearly your customers are in a different moment. Have you thought about making, your own sort of revenue mix and kind of model? Have you shifted it in this moment, or are you thinking about shifting it?
Yeah, so before COVID happened, we were selling to schools through their financial aid department, which was both the best folks to talk to about student debt, but also meant that our sales cycles were really, really long because we had to get levels of departmental approval. Financial aid budgets were sometimes big at schools, sometimes really small. Something that I learned from watching these technology adoptions happen after coronavirus is oftentimes the quickest adoptions at schools happen because consumers have already adopted a technology and then they bring it into the educational space. So like Zoom is a great example of this. The Google suite of products is a really good example of this. People were using Google Docs and Google Sheets to run their personal lives and then brought those into the education environment. So looking at that, we're trying to look at, can we build a consumer technology platform based off of this software that we built that instructors or students would use that then schools could adopt in more of like a bottoms up approach than a top down approach of having to go through a whole administrative sales cycle. And I think that's really the future, because the schools, since they're so big and they're serving so many people, it does take them a really long time to make a purchasing decision because of course they want to have the best technology. So it more often happens when individuals within the school are adopting something versus the entire school.
Yeah, for sure. And then how have your investors reacted in this moment? We've been talking a lot here at the center about this challenging time for startups to be able to raise capital. I mean, how have you sort of, demonstrated to your investors that you're continuing to add value? And then also, have you tried to attract new funding in this moment, kind of existing and then positioning yourself for, additional rounds? How have you managed?
So the first thing I want to say is I feel really lucky for the position that we're in because we managed our cash well enough and had enough revenue that before making this change, we still have enough runway to test a couple of things. The startups that are really going to be in trouble during this downturn are the startups that we're trying to fundraise right now and don't have enough cash to pivot their business models or experiment with different things, which every company is going to have to do during this time. So it's one part luck of where we are in the cycle, but I also do think there's something about conserving cash and being really wise that actually female founders tend to be better at, is like really looking at every line item in the business and saying like, does this serve us fulfilling our purpose? If not, let's keep it to the core mission. So I feel really lucky about that because I know other founders that raised around the same time that I did that have run out of money a lot quicker because they haven't been as methodical. How we've worked with the investors that we currently have, including Oceans, is it was probably the scariest moment of being an entrepreneur so far, to have to go to the investors who believe in me and believe in this business that like I of course believe in, which is why I started it, and say to them, something's not working. We're going to have to change something. And I feel really lucky that they've all been really supportive, but I think that's because I went to them with a plan. If you're ever in a position where you have investors, they just want to know that you're thinking through everything. And they also want to know that you can ask for help. So it's like going to them with one part, here's my plan, and another part, I want feedback on the plan because you guys have a wider diversity of experiences than I do. In terms of looking for new funding, I would say an interesting shift that has happened is venture capital firms, they're still open for business, but in this moment of upheaval and change, I think there's not only a higher bar than ever for what type of business you're building, but also for how ambitious it is. Like when we were first trying to figure out how to respond to this moment, I battle tested some ideas with investors, and some of my pivots that were, a couple degrees this way or a couple degrees that way, investors said, like, you're not thinking big enough. If you come to me with a totally crazy idea, but it sounds like something that could be huge, I'd rather fund that than fund something that you can prove in a couple months. So I actually think that's a really good thing, and it's going to be good for entrepreneurs.
I love that you just said that, because we talk a lot about sort of, in some business models, kind of, smaller incremental change versus this massive kind of upheaval of change.
Right.
So I love that you just said, I mean, you clearly have the right investors if they're pushing you to kind of think ambitiously and come to them with ambitious ideas. I love the way you just framed that. There's so many questions I have from everything you just shared. So you brought up being a female entrepreneur. So I want to kind of dig into that first. Oftentimes, women in business are sort of immediately asked, how is it different to be a female leader in business or female CEO or founder in your case? Talk to us a little bit about, what you've experienced, juxtaposed to maybe some of your other male founders that you've been either pitching against for funding or that you've met along the way. And I guess one question in particular, do you think that it's harder to be female or to be young, or is the combination of the two sort of challenging? Because, in your bio, as folks know, and in the setup that I gave of you, you started Piecewise as a University of Chicago student. And so you're obviously not a student anymore, but talk to us a little bit about being a female entrepreneur, but then also being, a younger female entrepreneur, and how your experience has been.
Definitely. Well, the first thing that I'll say is that I think because this conversation has been happening for a few years now, even just anecdotally based on my experience, I think things have really improved, where like part of the reason why these conversations were prompted is because as recent as 5 years ago, you would go to a venture capital firm and it would be like 30 people and there wouldn't be a single female employee. And that has really changed, partially because of these conversations. It's still not perfect, of course, but people are at least self-aware, and you at least know that there's going to be someone sitting around the table that's saying, are we applying the same standards to people based on their identity? Like, have we invested in founders that had similar traction levels based on maybe being able to relate to them a little bit more because they're an alumni of a certain school or they fit a certain demographic? So I think it's gotten a lot better, but that's my hypothesis on why it's gotten better is it's not necessarily diversity of founders, because founders have always been diverse. People have always been doing the work. It's diversity of venture capital firms increasing and people asking questions about what businesses are venture fundable. Because like there have always been female entrepreneurs. There have always been female entrepreneurs of color. There's always been entrepreneurs of color. It's just a question of like who gets venture funding to take their business to another level. I think what's tech has a certain obsession with young people, but it's most of the time it's young people that fit a certain narrative. Like you've all read the there's a bunch of magazine stories that will be like Elon Musk like played with rocket ships when he was little, and it's like, well, actually a bunch of little kids do that. Like just because it fits a certain narrative doesn't mean that it's predictive of someone's future. And so I think in this conversation, people have started to become not just more skeptical of that narrative, but what biases are contained in that it's like, there's so many creative people, there's so many people in jobs that probably could be having more impact if they started companies. And so I think as a founder, what you have to figure out really is what is your narrative, which doesn't have to necessarily fit that cookie cutter shape, but it has to be compelling. Like, you have to be able to tell a story about yourself that makes people understand why you're doing what you do, and the right investors for you will be compelled by that story, and the wrong investors for you will be like, I don't really get it. So yeah, I would say I hope that it just keeps getting better and better. But the way that it does is by having these conversations, and all of my investors have been super supportive. And they've introduced me to people where sometimes when I meet other portfolio founders of my investors, it's like most of them are men, and then we'll have a great conversation and they're like, wow, I didn't realize that there were this many young women growing businesses like this. So I think it's also part of an awareness where it's like, yeah, we're out here. Like, everyone's doing a lot of work and it is building great stuff. Yeah.
It's a great answer. And it made me think of a couple of other things I want to sort of, ask and follow up. What you just said, if I could drill it down to kind of one sentence, it's almost like you're saying, find your people, right? There've been people who are supporting the narrative and really sort of supporting what you just described as authenticity and solving the problem that you're seeing. Right. Let's go back to that for a minute, and really kind of the macro, theme and topic of student debt. There's been a lot of writing, as you noted, about kind of the state of higher ed right now, especially the state of, elite higher ed that's very, expensive. And so you started this business because you were wrestling and saw this, major problem with student debt and being able to sort of figure out how to consolidate it and pay it off. What are some of your opinions of this? I mean, I know you'd shared that some of your customers, your initial customers were trade schools, right? And so students who are going to learn a very specific trade where in turn, they were likely going to be able to sort of pay their debt off in working in that trade. Some other schools that's harder. And I just raised a couple of things that, have circulated in the news. The president of Brown University wrote a widely circulated op-ed in the Times around kind of the return in the fall of higher ed. And then somebody who I follow at NYU, Scott Galloway, wrote sort of an opposing piece about how higher ed kind of the whole model needs to be blown up. So I guess when you think about, student debt as kind of a macro problem, I mean, do you think this is a reckoning moment for looking more towards like a trade school model? Do you think that these, you went to University of Chicago, it's an expensive, highly ranked school. Do you think it will make them look again at kind of the price tag of these higher schools, or not so much?
Yeah. So on the spectrum of like Christina Paxton, she's the Brown University president, she is like, it's really important for us to have school in person. And then Scott Galloway, who's this NYU professor, is like, higher education's due for a reckoning. Nobody wants to pay $50,000 to be on a Zoom class. Like, it's time for a change. I think they both say things that are valid. I think in-person community is really hard to replicate. And I think a lot of the reason why kids go to school is for the social experience of being together on a campus and growing as a person. And it's not only the in-class experience. However, if I had to gravitate towards one end of the spectrum, I think Scott Galloway's points that, higher education costs 14 times what it did 40 years ago, but it's not 14 times better. And like the center cannot hold there. And I think we're just starting to see a shift that now that 70% of students take out debt, with a very mixed range of outcomes. Some people being able to pay it down no problem. Some people really having a lot of difficulty paying it down and saying that wasn't worth it for me. Like, I got something out of college, but I didn't want to be in debt for 25 years. I think we're just starting to see a shift where it's not just an internal conversation about higher ed and how can higher ed change. It's a conversation about the entire economy and how employers are starting to they're starting to take away the requirement to have a BA for entry-level positions. They're starting to look more at things like coding boot camps and trade schools and things that actually might be a better fit for whatever workforce they're starting to hire. So to me, what I think is going to happen is like the Ivy League schools, they're always going to stay expensive because they build a product around scarcity. And in fact, it's almost kind of artificial scarcity that they're like, we know we have to accept a small enough number of people to keep this degree prestigious. But the entire Ivy League serves like way less students, especially students from diverse economic backgrounds, than like one public school. Like the University of California, Berkeley serves more low-income students than the entire Ivy League combined. So what I think is going to happen is that the Ivy Leagues will stay the Ivy League. They'll, they might even increase their prices. But I think for public universities and even smaller private schools, if they want to stay alive as businesses, they have to be able to cater to different types of learners, which will mean expanding online offerings to grow the size of their campus. And I think that will objectively be a good thing for the world. I think for anybody that wants to go to a college and wants to be there for 2 or 4 years, that's always going to be an option. But if you're working full time, if you have kids, if there's something else going on in your life, like you should be able to get a degree in whatever you want doing it online. And what we need for that to happen is way better online tools that shorten the distance between the in-person and the online learning experience. Because talking to students about what it's like to learn on Zoom, it's really hard. It's not the same as being in person, but I think there's a lot of technology gaps that could actually be bridged where maybe you don't feel like you're on a campus, but maybe you're a working adult who has 3 kids and you don't need to feel like you're on a campus. So that's those are some of the technologies that we're trying to figure out how to fill the gaps for. Is like, how do you make online learning better? Because it can be so much more accessible and it can result in a much more educated workforce because you're not asking people to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every time they want to improve themselves.
Yeah, for sure. Those are great points. It also sounds like you have another business idea in there or another extension off of Piecewise as of right now. Those are, that's, you're responding to the moment, seeing sort of the problem that we're in and really thinking about how to build on it and solve that problem. So it's cool to hear sort of your thought process, especially given what you've got now to what you're wanting to help with.
I wish I could get in a time machine. Like I wish I could I want to know what education looks like in 100 years. And it's like, we don't know because we're all going to be the people to figure it out.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so as you're talking, I would just remind folks to use the chat feature to add your questions if you don't want to come off mute so that you can type it in the chat box and I will raise it for Madeleine and for the group. As you were talking, Madeleine, it was just making me think of on Piecewise now, if you have alumni who pay down their student debt, one, I'd just be curious to know sort of what that number is compared to the whole number of users that you have in your platform. But then also, how do you celebrate them? Because that had been sort of the original, problem to solve. I mean, have you seen a lot of people basically check the box and, they're debt free, they use your tool to manage through payments? I guess your business is still new, but has that happened? And if so, how do you celebrate them?
Yeah, so that's one of the best moments of building a software is when someone uses it to actually achieve something. So for the students who have gotten out of debt on Piecewise, we make a huge deal out of it. There's like confetti that comes on the screen, and then we send them basically an invitation that says like, you've done it. Let's talk about what your next steps are. And we have like a personalized call with me and that person to get them set up with a financial advisor, and we cover the cost. So it's just like, it's only, since our business is so new, it's only been a few students that's happened for, but just the feeling of trying to put them on a lifelong path towards financial stability it's really exciting, and it's the best feeling ever. And even as we go through this pivot, it's like, I'm so glad for everything that we've done so far, that we've been able to help a bunch of people. So
That's great. That's great. Let's talk a little bit. We have about 15 minutes left. You as a CEO, running a business in this moment with employees, with
yeah.
overhead of rent in New York City. Talk to us a little bit about how that experience has been, especially as the world's struggling and there are sort of limited resources and obviously limited revenue for a lot of small businesses in this moment. How have you juggled that, having employees and then also the overhead of an office?
Yeah. So when I feel like every business and school and everyone went through this moment where when shelter in place first happened, I thought we were going to be back in like a number of weeks. Like I didn't understand how intense it was. I didn't understand how intense a shift it was going to be. But as soon as I fully processed that data, I was like, the best thing that I can do is make sure my employees know what to expect. So we are remote now until at least September, because I was like, if you want to go somewhere else, if you want to go spend time with your family, you're more than welcome to do that. Like I want you to understand what the expectations are so that you can take care of yourself. And then we also just put in that everyone has to take at least a day off, one day every month, because I was like, we're trying to pivot this business and grow it, and also processing that there's a pandemic happening means that everybody's distracted, and so everybody needs to take a day every month to let it all out and feel better. I did have to lay off one person, which was really, really hard, and it's the worst. You feel like you've brought somebody into this mission and like they have taken a bet on you, and having to do that is terrible. But I helped them find another position, so they're going to be okay. But just being transparent, being as transparent as you can, especially when you have a small team, of here are the things that I have control over and here are the things that I don't. So this is what we're doing, but however far the business goes is directly a result of our output, is I think how you rally people around something that if you work at a larger company, you don't really have to think about, because it's like, if somebody doesn't get work done, on a given day at a larger company, it's like the company's still running. If you have a 6-person team like us, then you're at least 1/6 of the outputs. So it's been tough. And I think this is a huge moment of uncertainty for all startups. It's also something where like schools are our customers, and despite being large institutions, they're not immune to changes in the market. I think all startups are going through something where working with other small businesses and working with customers, everybody's really vulnerable. And so the only thing you can do is talk through it and try to be really open. We didn't want our landlord to lose money on us renting the office. So we worked something out where I said like, hey, you're a great landlord. I love this office space. I don't want it given away. Can we pay discounted rent? And it's like, you don't get things if you don't ask for them. And most of the time, everybody's really just trying to do their best. So I think like not being overwhelmed by everything happening has only been feasible by me taking everything one by one and just taking a breath and saying like, everyone's trying to do their best. How do we not all mess up each other's business models? Like, how do we move through this?
Yeah, that's great guidance. And it did make me think of one other element, which was what you just talked about with renegotiating with your own landlord and thinking about sort of this, this moment that we're in where a lot of businesses, large and small, are thinking about remote work ongoing. Would that work for Piecewise, or do you feel the need to collaborate in person with your team when you have a chance to? I mean, you've kept the lease, you've reduced it, but do you see yourselves going back? And if so, could there ever be a moment where you could continue to build this business, disparate, separated from each other?
Yeah, I think there are so many trade-offs. I think individual focus work, especially software engineering and programming work, you actually can do better by yourself at home. But what you lose is something super valuable, which is coming up with ideas together spontaneously. Like that just doesn't happen remote. And it also doesn't happen in the confines of an hour-long Zoom call. You can't get on a Zoom and say, hey, let's have a brainstorm. So what we've been trying to do is mimic our in-person interactions as much as possible. So if I have an idea, even if I'm self-conscious about it, I will try to message it to someone on Slack, even if I think it looks like silly in writing in a way that maybe I wouldn't think about when I was saying it out loud. And by forcing ourselves to do that, we have been able to come up with some ideas. But I think like this is a big experiment in whether or not remote works. Only having the experience of working together, I am so team in-person collaboration, but this is also forcing us to grow in a totally different direction. So like as soon as it's safe to be back in person, I think we'll try to be, but what I think will happen with most businesses is I don't think anybody is going to be fully in person ever again. I think it's going to be a mixture where you work from home on certain days, you come together on certain days. Some days are in person and collaborative, other days are heads down work. And I think that's really going to change what office leasing looks like. Like even for going back, we've been like, we have this office. What if we don't need it? Should we be renting conference rooms? Should we be, meeting at a restaurant and having breakfast 3 times a week? Like, what does that look like? And it's just opening up these possibilities that nobody was thinking of before because we didn't have to. So we'll see. I do have to say the engineers are ecstatic. They never want to go back to in person because they're like, everyone's so distracting. Now I can get my work done heads down, but you got to have a balance of both, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's great. And you're, I think, reiterating a lot of what we've heard. And I think also too, since you're leaning into solving problems that you're seeing that schools are having now around moving on, learning online, what you just said almost sort of responds to that, right? Because if you're trying and working on solving those problems, recognizing that your own team can kind of, be separated and could, may function in a separated way ongoing, it sort of speaks to the customers you're talking about too. I have 2 more questions, so I want to give folks sort of a chance to think of theirs. And if they want to come off mute, there haven't been any questions in the chat, which is really unusual. So people are shy on a Monday. But I wanted to go back to your time as a student, since I am no longer working in tech myself, and I'm sitting in the incubator of a state university, or a space that we had planned to launch as a bit of an incubator for our student startups and community startups. We are, of course, now challenged ourselves about co-location, which is why I asked you that. Talk to us a little bit, for the students on the call, the ways that University of Chicago supported you as you were building this business, and ways that you think universities now can be supporting startups, especially in this moment, that are built by their students. Just curious to know kind of what worked and what guidance you give us as we continue to grow what we're doing in Montclair.
Totally. I'm going to add a third part of that question, which is like, what can students do? Like, regardless of what your university is doing, what can you do as a student? So at U Chicago, they have the college, which is undergrads, and then they have the Booth School of Business. And the Booth School of Business opens its entrepreneurship classes to the undergraduate college students. So I took a class at Booth School of Business called Building the New Venture, that basically was like, come up with a business idea, let's test it in very well documented ways over the course of 10 weeks. And at the end of it, you get to have a pitch competition, and VCs are going to grade it. And if you get first place, you get an A in the class, no matter what. This was like a really challenging quarter when I was taking lots of hard classes. So I was like excited that this class was the most fun. And I was also like, oh, I really want to get first prize so that I can get an A. And that is where Piecewise started. It was not me trying to do a business after school. It was me saying, what's most top of mind for me right now is my student debt. What if we built a really beautiful educational platform for student debt? And the idea got better and better over 10 weeks. And then I pitched this to VCs, and not only did me and my team get first place, but a lot of VCs were like, you should do this after school. Like you could raise funding. What are you doing after school? And I'd had a consulting position lined up that I'd already accepted. And so I would have never thought to do this if I hadn't had people that were actually decision makers saying like, oh yeah, you should try this. Like it's a no-brainer that this is something that you should do because you will learn so much from it. So that was the first thing that happened. We then won 2 pitch competitions at U Chicago, and then we got a check from a student-run venture capital firm called Dorm Room Fund. So that was our starter funding. It was about $50,000, and at the time, it was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. It was like $10K from one pitch competition, $10K from another pitch competition, and then like $30K from Dorm Room Fund and some other student-led initiatives. And I was like, this is so much money. We never need to raise money ever again. I was wrong, of course, because it's like really, it's really hard to grow a business. But even a small amount of capital, if you can use it to test your business idea in a real way, like that goes super far. Because when you're in college, like I didn't have any money in my bank account to like test something out, even if it was a really good idea. So I think the first thing school should do is like, even if it's a $300 or a $500 grant, giving students money with the caveat that they have to show you what they do with it and show how they're trying to use it to build their business. Like it can go really far. It can be the difference between someone knowing whether or not their business idea is viable, and it can be something where like maybe you have a great idea and you spend $2,000 on it and you don't get any bites. That's super valuable data to be like, okay, something was wrong. What can I change to try to make it work? So that's the first thing is like money. And I think I Fund Women looks like, looking at the types of initiatives that they have, it's exactly in this vein of like, let's give women either no strings attached or strings attached towards entrepreneurship funding so that they can experiment, because experimenting is the only way that you figure anything out. The second thing I'd say that school should do is like matching people with mentors really helps. Matching them with university faculty can also really help, because sometimes if you match people with mentors that are entrepreneurs or operators or investors, it's like they want to help students, but their time is limited. The people that really helped me figure a lot of stuff out were university professors and business professors that like had office hours carved out in their schedule to say like, I'll talk to you for 2 hours, which is a little bit harder to do with people that are out in the workforce that's not the university. And then the third part of the question, which is what can students do? This being in college is the only time in your life where you are going to be able to experiment with things for this much time and not really have it have any consequence. Like once you enter the workforce, you definitely can become an entrepreneur, but you're never going to have this much unstructured time to be like, I wonder what would happen if I ran a Google ad campaign for $25 on like vegan pet food. Like just like the random things in the back of your mind that you think could be businesses, now is the time to test them out, because not only is it the time to fail, but like that's how you learn things. And it gets harder to learn things if you don't develop those muscles early on. So regardless of what's happening at the school, if you have an idea, like start building it, start getting input on it, especially if you're at a school that's supportive like Montclair. Talk to people about it. Like there's people who would love to help you. I wish I'd done more of that. I feel like the course that I took at U Chicago gave me permission to do this in a structured way. And as soon as I did that, I was like, oh my God, duh, I could have been doing this all along. I could have been experimenting with cool stuff, but I wasn't, because I was so worried about like my math and economics classes, which is fine, but I wish I'd known earlier.
Such great guidance. I'm writing down all of this. And my final question for you was around raising capital. I had forgotten that you had gotten money from Dorm Room Fund. We love them. Molly Fowler, their new CEO, is actually supposed to be a finalist judge for us this year. And then we consolidated into one pitch competition day because we were virtual. But we love their work and what they do. So all of that is incredibly valuable. And I love what you described about going to each competition and sort of, gathering this prize money, right, to make it add up to something substantial. My last question for you really sort of is around, that type of money, that type of seed funding, that sort of no strings attached, angel investors or venture capital. I mean, for people who are just starting out, would your guidance be just sort of get whatever funding you can? Or do you encourage, I mean, clearly you've raised over $1 million in, venture capital yourself. Do you encourage going the VC route also? Because I think a lot of people, here, especially students who are at the beginning, think that they don't want to give a part of their business to anyone else. So the inclination is to go to an angel or to go to, something like an iFund Women platform.
Right.
But what would your guidance be?
So I think it depends on your business. It depends on your business, because if you can start a business out of your dorm room selling something like t-shirts, where like the t-shirt costs $10 to make and it's $20 a t-shirt, so you're making a 50% margin every time, that business, you never need VC funding because you don't need outside capital to get started. You can grow it really large and you can keep all of the upside for yourself, which is amazing. But if you are a founder who doesn't have technical skills and you need to hire people to make the dream of your business a reality, you probably don't have tens of thousands of dollars to pay someone as a college student. And so there are probably going to be upfront costs that you can't cover. If you're in that position and if you're trying to grow something that could get really big as a business, that's when I'd say you look for venture capital. But the thing to keep in mind when you're doing that is that you're signing up to have a high growth business. Like, you are signing up to send out a monthly email that says, here's what we accomplished this month. Here's what happened. And if something goes wrong, you are basically answering to that. And so part of the reason why we're even going through this pivot is because if we were running as a business by ourselves and we didn't have venture capital to answer to, we could do it on whatever timeline we wanted, as long as we stayed alive as a business. If you have venture capital supporting your business, you are going to be expected to grow. And I think it's been an awesome experience because it's taught me so many things. But I also think if I start another business, I'm going to look pretty critically at what is the cost structure, and do I need to raise venture capital, or do I want this to be something that isn't as intense and exponentially or like exponential growth oriented as a venture-backed startup. So yeah, I think the central question to ask in this entire explanation is like, how big can I grow the business without any outside capital? If you have $500 in savings that you can use to make it into something, you might never need outside money. But if your dream is just going to stay a dream unless you have some capital, I would say going the VC route can really leapfrog your growth. It could help you do things that you could never do before, but you do have to understand what you're getting into. And I'm really lucky because I have amazing investors. But sometimes it's really hard for founders. Sometimes founders have constant anxiety because they're like, I raised all this money to make something grow huge and it's not working out the way I thought it would, which it almost never does. So yeah, I think especially for students, it's hard because students don't have savings to start their own business. So they're almost always in a position where venture capital seems like the answer. Definitely think about it. And if you decide to raise, it's going to be you're signing up for like a 10-year adventure, basically. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. Honest and really helpful to our students. And please join me in thanking Madeleine Barr, CEO and founder of Piecewise, for being with us today and sharing her insights. We wish you the best of luck as you grow your business.